The first man did not scream, not because there was no pain, but because everything happened too fast. One step forward, one shift in the ground, and then he was gone, swallowed by something he had not seen, and the men behind him stopped, not out of fear at first, but confusion, because what they thought was a simple chase had just become something else entirely. Welcome to Story of the Black Past, where we uncover hidden stories, powerful truths, and forgotten moments from history. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this, and if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Thank you for being here. Stay until the end, because this story will keep you thinking. You will not want to miss a single moment. Now relax, remove all distractions, and pay close attention as we begin. They called her Ruth, though it was not the name she was born with. It was the name she carried after everything had been taken and replaced. But among those who truly knew her, the name meant something else, something stronger, something that could not be easily broken. She had lived long enough to understand something many did not, that survival is not always about running faster. Sometimes it is about knowing where to stand, where to step, and more importantly, where not to step. The land she moved through was not unfamiliar to her. It was a place she had walked, studied, understood in ways that others never bothered to, because to them it was just forest, just trees and ground, something to pass through, not something to learn. But Ruth had learned it. Every turn, every weak patch of earth, every hidden dip, every place where the ground looked safe, but was not. The men who chased her did not see any of this. They saw only a woman alone moving ahead of them. And that was enough to make them confident, because confidence often comes from underestimating what is in front of you. They were many, more than 20, armed, certain, used to being the ones in control, and that certainty made them careless. Ruth did not run blindly. She moved with direction. Not fast, not slow, but with purpose, because this was not escape, not in the way they believed. This was something else, something planned. Long before that moment, she had known they would come. Not exactly when, but that they would, because people who rely on control do not let go easily. They follow, they pursue, they try to take back what they believe is theirs. And Ruth had prepared for that, not with weapons, not with direct force, but with something else, understanding. The forest was not empty, it was full of movement, full of hidden spaces, full of places where the ground could betray those who did not know it. She had spent time there, not once, not twice, but many times, watching, testing, learning where pressure changed the ground, where roots created false support, where water softened the earth just enough to make it unstable. And she remembered, the first trap was simple, not built, but used, a place where the ground dipped beneath a layer that looked solid. A step taken with confidence becomes a fall. The man who stepped there did not see it, could not, because he was focused forward, focused on her, and that focus was his mistake. When he disappeared, the others stopped, looked around, confused, because there was no struggle, no sound that made sense, only absence, and absence creates questions, but not immediately fear. Not yet. Ruth did not turn, did not look back, because looking back slows movement, and she did not need to see. She already knew what would happen next. The men regrouped, spoke louder now, more alert, but still confident, because one loss can be explained, an accident, a mistake, something small. They continued, closer together, more cautious, but still moving forward, and that was what she needed, because the closer they stayed, the less space they had, and in that forest, space is survival. She led them deeper, not into darkness, but into complexity, into paths that twisted, ground that shifted, spaces where sound carried differently, where direction became unclear. The second man fell, not in the same way, not the same place, but the same result. A step, a shift, and gone. Now the silence changed, now it carried something heavier, because two is not accident, two is pattern. And patterns mean intention. The men began to slow, to question, to look not just ahead but around, but by then, they were already inside, not just the forest, but something else, something shaped, something prepared, something waiting. Ruth continued, steady, unseen, because she was no longer being chased, not really. She was guiding, leading, pulling them into a space where their numbers, their strength, their weapons would not matter, because none of those things work without understanding, and understanding was what they lacked. The forest closed in, not physically, but mentally, because uncertainty had begun, and once uncertainty begins, it grows, and as they followed her deeper, as the ground beneath them became less certain, as the silence became heavier, one truth slowly began to form: they were not hunting, they were being led. The preparation had not begun that day. It had started long before the men ever stepped into the forest, long before they decided to hunt her, because Ruth understood something clearly. Danger does not always announce itself, but it often repeats, and when it repeats, it can be prepared for. She had seen signs before, not of this exact moment, but of patterns, of men who moved through land without respect, who believed that numbers and weapons were enough, who did not look closely at where they stepped, who did not listen to what the environment was telling them. So she had learned, not in a single moment, but over time, testing the ground after rain, watching how water collected beneath layers of soil, noticing where roots created hollow spaces underneath, where the surface appeared firm but could not hold weight. She did not dig deep pits, did not build obvious traps, because those can be found, can be avoided. Instead, she used what was already there, natural weaknesses hidden beneath ordinary ground, and she marked them, not with visible signs, but in memory, in steps, in the way she moved around them, again and again, until the paths became clear to her, even if they looked invisible to others. The reason they were hunting her was not spoken among them as something complex. They reduced it to something simple, something that made sense to them: control, punishment, example, because in their minds, she had crossed a line. She had refused, not loudly, not publicly, but clearly, and refusal, in a system built on obedience, is seen as a threat. But what they did not understand was that her refusal had not been sudden. It had been building, quietly, over time, in moments where she saw what they did, how they acted, what they believed they could do without consequence. And those moments stayed, not as anger alone, but as understanding, understanding of who they were, how they moved, how they thought, and that understanding was what she used now. Back in the forest, the men were beginning to feel something they had not expected, not just confusion, not just uncertainty, but something deeper, something that settled into their movements, into their decisions. Fear, not loud, not overwhelming at first, but present, the kind that makes a person hesitate, look twice, question what they once trusted. They began to spread out slightly, not by plan, but by reaction, trying to see more, trying to avoid stepping where others had stepped. But spreading out created gaps, and gaps create weakness. Ruth adjusted, not suddenly, but naturally, leading them into areas where those gaps would matter, where one step in the wrong place would not just affect one person, but isolate them, separate them from the group. And once separated, they were alone. The third fall came from the side, not the center, not where most attention was focused, but from where someone had stepped slightly away, trying to be cautious, trying to avoid the same mistake. But caution without knowledge is still blindness, and he disappeared without warning. Now the fear had formed, now it was visible, in the way they spoke, shorter, sharper, in the way they moved, slower, less certain. Some wanted to turn back. The idea began to form, quiet at first, then stronger, because when survival becomes the priority, the goal changes. But turning back was no longer simple, because the path behind them was no longer clear. The same confusion that led them forward now surrounded them. They tried to retrace, but the forest did not reveal its paths easily. What looked familiar was not. What seemed like the way out was not certain. Ruth had not only guided them forward, she had removed their sense of direction. Because direction is not just about paths, it is about understanding, and they did not have it. The men began to argue. Not loudly, but with tension, with urgency, because no one could agree, no one could lead, and without leadership, groups break, they lose structure, they lose control. Ruth listened, from ahead, from the side, from spaces they could not see, because she no longer needed to stay in front. She could move around them, guide from different angles, shift their movement without being seen. Because this was no longer a chase, it was something else entirely, a process, a gradual breaking of certainty. The forest seemed to change with them, not in form, but in feeling. What had once seemed manageable, now felt unpredictable. What had once felt open, now felt closed, because perception had shifted, and once perception changes, everything follows. The men tightened again, trying to stay together, trying to regain control, but now they were reacting, not leading, and reacting is always weaker than understanding. Ruth moved them deeper, not into darkness, but into confusion, into a space where their numbers no longer gave them strength, where their weapons had no clear use, where every step was uncertain, and as the fear grew, as the pattern became undeniable, as the losses continued, one truth settled among them, quiet but clear. This was not an accident. This was not the forest alone. This was someone who knew, someone who planned, someone who was still there, watching. And as that realization took hold, as the fear turned from the unknown to something intentional, the situation changed completely, because now they were not just afraid of the land, they were afraid of her. The moment panic truly took hold was not loud at first. It did not begin with shouting or running. It began with hesitation, with the slight pause before each step, with the way the men looked at the ground longer than before, as if expecting it to betray them at any moment. That hesitation spread quickly. One man stopped, then another, and suddenly the group was no longer moving as one. They were fragments, each thinking, each doubting, each trying to decide what to do next without fully trusting the others. The arguments began again, this time sharper, less controlled, voices rising, not in confidence but in fear. Some demanded they turn back immediately, others insisted they push forward, believing that retreat would only lead to more confusion. But the truth was simple. Neither direction felt safe, because they no longer understood the space they were in. Ruth listened, from a distance, still, calm, because this was the moment she had been building toward, not a fight, not a direct confrontation, but a breaking of structure, of trust, of certainty. The men began to separate more clearly now, not just small gaps, but full breaks, groups forming, then breaking again, because no one could agree, no one could lead, and without leadership, fear grows faster. One group moved to left, another stayed still, another tried to circle back, but the forest did not guide them, it confused them. Paths looked similar, sounds echoed in ways that misled direction. The ground shifted unpredictably, and with each wrong step, the situation worsened. Another fall, not hidden this time. A man cried out briefly, then silence. The sound cut through the tension, sharp, real, undeniable. Now panic had a voice, now it was no longer controlled. Men began to move faster, too fast, stepping without checking, choosing speed over caution. And in that, they made more mistakes, because speed and uncertainty creates failure. Others froze, afraid to move at all, afraid that any step would be the wrong one, and still. The forest closed in around them, not physically, but mentally, because their perception had completely changed. What once looked like open ground now looked like danger. What once felt stable now felt uncertain. Ruth moved quietly along the edges of their movement, not rushing, not revealing herself, because she did not need to be seen. Her presence was already felt in the fear, in the confusion, in the realization that someone was guiding this. The men began to turn on each other, not with weapons, but with blame, accusations, short tempers, because when people lose control of their environment, they try to control each other, and that creates division. Division weakens them further. One man pushed another aside, another shouted directions no one followed, another tried to take control, but was ignored because trust was gone. And without trust, there is no unity. Ruth shifted their direction again, subtly, drawing them into tighter ground, into areas where movement was harder, where mistakes would cost more, because now it was not just about leading them, it was about letting their own fear do the work. The numbers continued to fall, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, one here, another there. Each loss adding weight, each absence increasing fear, until the group that had entered together was no longer a group at all. They were scattered, broken, lost. Some tried to run, blindly, without direction, hoping that movement alone would lead them out. But movement without knowledge is just wandering, and wandering, in a place like that, leads nowhere. Others called out, voices echoing, hoping for response, but the responses were fewer now, more distant, more uncertain, until even the calls began to fade. Ruth stopped moving for a moment, listening, feeling the space around her, because she understood something. The breaking point had been reached. They were no longer hunting, no longer pursuing, no longer thinking as a group. They were surviving, individually, desperately, and in that state. They had already lost. The forest had taken control, not because it changed, but because they had lost their ability to understand it. And without understanding, there is no control, only reaction, only fear, only mistakes. And as the last pieces of structure disappeared, as the voices grew fewer, as the movement became scattered and uncertain, one truth became clear: none of them were leaving the way they came. The final collapse did not come with one last event. It came as the slow ending of everything that had once held them together, the last pieces of order fading until nothing remained but scattered movement, broken direction, and silence growing heavier with each passing moment. By now, there was no group, no leader, no shared plan. Only individuals moving through a space they no longer understood, each step uncertain, each decision made in isolation, because the structure that had given them confidence at the beginning had completely disappeared. Some tried to run, not toward anything specific, just away, away from the fear, away from the confusion. But running without direction only led them deeper into the same uncertainty, the same ground that had already taken so many. Others slowed completely, barely moving, testing each step as if the earth itself could no longer be trusted. And in many places, it could not. The forest remained the same, but they had changed, their understanding gone, their confidence broken, their movements driven by fear instead of thought. And that was what made the difference. Ruth watched from a distance, no longer guiding actively, no longer needing to adjust their path, because they were already lost, completely. The last cluster of men tried one final time to come together, to gather what remained of their strength, to choose a direction and move as one, believing that unity might still save them. But unity requires trust, and trust had been broken long before. Their steps were uneven, their decisions uncertain, their movements slow, and in that hesitation, the forest did what it had done from the beginning. It revealed their weakness, one misstep, then another, not dramatic, not loud, but final, because at this point, even the smallest mistake could not be recovered. The voices grew fewer, calls unanswered, movements no longer followed, until eventually, there was only silence, not sudden, but complete, the kind of silence that settles after everything has ended. Ruth did not wait, did not look for confirmation, because she already knew. She had understood the pattern from the beginning, and the pattern had reached its end. She moved carefully toward the edge of the forest, not rushing, not making unnecessary sound, because even in the final moments, caution matters, awareness matters, and survival depends on never assuming that everything is finished. The ground began to change beneath her feet, more stable, more familiar, the dense confusion of the forest giving way to open space, to clarity, to direction. She stepped out, not into freedom, but into possibility, because survival is not an ending, it is a continuation. Behind her, the forest remained, unchanged, silent, holding everything that had happened within it. No bodies would be easily found, no clear path retraced, no simple explanation given, only absence, only the knowledge that many had entered and none had returned. And that absence would become something else, a story, not told clearly, not fully understood, but carried, in whispers, in warnings, in the way people spoke of that forest afterward. Because places remember, even when people do not fully know what happened. Ruth did not return, did not stay near the edges, did not look back. Because looking back does not change the past, it only risks the future. She moved forward, into a world that was still uncertain, still dangerous, but no longer controlled by those who had chased her. And that was the difference. Her strength had not come from force, not from fighting directly, but from understanding, from patience, from knowing how to use what was already there. And that knowledge had changed everything. The forest stood behind her, still, quiet, unmoved, but carrying a truth that would remain long after that moment, that even those who believe they hold power can lose it when they step into a space they do not understand. The aftermath did not arrive with clear answers, it arrived with absence, and absence is often more powerful than any explanation, because when many go in and none return, people are left to fill the silence with their own understanding. At first, those who had sent the men waited, expecting delay, expecting difficulty, because the forest was known to be challenging, but not impossible, not something that could take so many without leaving a trace. Days passed, then more, and the waiting became something else. Concern, not spoken openly, but present. Small groups were sent to the edges, not deep, never deep, calling out, looking for signs, but the forest gave them nothing, no clear path, no bodies, no evidence that could be followed, only the same silence, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. They returned, without answers, and from that moment, the story began to spread, not through official words, not through records, but through movement, through whispers, through those who carried pieces of what they had heard from one place to another. The number of men changed in the telling, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, but the ending remained the same. They did not come back, and at the center of that story, a woman, alone, hunted, but not caught. Ruth's name was not always used. Sometimes she was not named at all. Sometimes she was described differently, but the meaning stayed. Someone who had turned a chase into something else, something the hunters did not survive. Among black communities, the story carried a different weight, not as fear but as recognition, as something that showed that knowledge, patience and understanding could overcome force, could change outcomes that seemed fixed. But it was not spoken loudly, not openly, because stories like that carry risk. They travel carefully, quietly, from one person to another. Among those who had once held power over her, the story moved differently, not as admiration, but as warning, because it revealed something they did not want to accept, that they could lose control, not in open battle, not in ways they understood, but in ways they could not predict. The forest itself became something more than land. It became a place people spoke of with caution, a place that carried a story, a place that reminded those who heard it that not every space could be controlled. Travelers avoided it. Hunters refused to enter it in large groups again. Even those who did not fully believe the story did not test it, because uncertainty creates hesitation, and hesitation changes behavior. Ruth did not return to that place, did not stay near it. Because survival required distance, required movement, required leaving behind what had already been done. Her story remained where it had happened, growing, changing slightly, but holding its meaning. She became something more than a person in that story. She became an idea, a symbol, not of force, but of understanding, of patience, of the ability to see what others ignore and use it. Time passed, new stories emerged, new events replaced old ones, but this one did not disappear, because it carried something deeper, something that connected to how people understood power, control, and the limits of both. And that is how stories like this survive, not through perfect detail, but through impact, through the way they shape thought, through the way they remain present, even when the people involved are long gone. The legacy did not fade with time, it settled deeper, becoming part of how people understood that place, how they moved around it, how they spoke of it even when they tried not to. Because once something happens that cannot be easily explained, it leaves a mark that does not disappear. The forest remained where it had always been, the same trees, the same ground, the same quiet paths that looked ordinary from a distance, but for those who knew the story, it was no longer just land, it carried meaning, it carried memory, it carried something unseen but strongly felt. The men who once would have entered without hesitation no longer did so, not in large numbers, not with the same confidence, because even if they did not fully believe the story, they could not ignore it either, and that uncertainty changed their behavior. They chose easier paths, more open ground, places they believed they could control, because control depends on understanding, and that forest had shown them that there were spaces where their understanding failed. Among black communities, the story became something quieter but stronger, not something shouted, not something exaggerated for effect, but something held carefully, because it carried truth, not just about what happened, but about what it meant. It showed that knowledge of the land, patience in action, and the ability to remain calm under pressure could change outcomes that seemed certain, that even when outnumbered, even when pursued, there were ways to survive. Ruth became part of that understanding, not as a public figure, not as a name written in history, but as a presence within the story, a reminder of what was possible when someone chose not to act blindly, but to think, to observe, to prepare. Her life after that moment was not recorded clearly, it did not become part of official history, but that did not take away from what she had done, because impact does not always depend on recognition, it depends on change, and change had already happened. The masters, though they would never admit it openly, adjusted their approach. They became more cautious in unfamiliar terrain, less certain in their assumptions, more aware that not every situation could be handled with force alone. That awareness may have been small, but it mattered, because small changes spread, they influence decisions, they shape behavior over time. The story of the forest became a quiet warning, passed along in different forms, sometimes detailed, sometimes simple, but always carrying the same core idea: that stepping into a space without understanding it can lead to consequences that cannot be controlled. And that idea remained, even as years passed, even as new events took place, because it was not just about that moment, it was about what it revealed. Ruth's victory was not loud, it was not seen by many, it was not celebrated openly, but it was real, and it was lasting, because she had not relied on strength alone. She had relied on understanding, on patience, on knowing when to move, and when to let the situation unfold on its own. And that kind of victory does not fade easily. It becomes part of how people think, how they act, how they see the world. The forest stood, unchanged, but never the same, because now it carried a story, a memory, a truth that those who knew would not forget. In the end, the story did not settle into a clear record. It did not become something written in books or announced in public. It remained where many powerful stories remain, in memory, in whispers, in the quiet understanding passed from one person to another. The forest stayed the same to those who did not know, just land, just trees, just a place to pass through. But to those who carried the story, it was something else entirely, a place that held meaning, a place that reminded them that not everything can be controlled, not everything can be predicted. The system around it continued, as systems often do, adjusting, adapting, trying to maintain itself, but never fully returning to what it had been. Because once something challenges the belief of absolute control, that belief does not return unchanged. The men who once would have walked into that forest with certainty no longer did so without hesitation. Even if they did not admit it, even if they tried to hide it, their actions revealed it, their caution revealed it, their avoidance revealed it. Among black communities, the story lived differently, not as something to boast about, not as something to turn into noise, but as something to carry, something to remember, something that showed that survival is not always about force. Sometimes it is about thinking, about knowing, about understanding what others overlook. Ruth's name may not have been spoken loudly, may not have been recorded in history, but her presence remained in that story, in the way people described what had happened, in the way they understood the meaning behind it, because she had done something important. She had taken a situation that seemed one-sided and changed it, not through strength alone, but through awareness, through patience, through the ability to see what others could not and use it. Her life continued beyond that moment in ways that were not recorded, in places that were not documented, but what she had already done was enough to shape how she would be remembered, not as someone who fought loudly, but as someone who understood deeply. And that kind of legacy lasts because it does not depend on being seen, it depends on what it changes. The forest remained, quiet, still, unchanged in appearance, but carrying something that could not be removed, a story, a truth, a reminder that even in a world where power seems fixed, there are always spaces where that power can be challenged, where knowledge can shift the outcome, where patience can overcome force. So when you think about this story, do not only think about the chase, the traps, the men who entered and did not return, think about what it reveals, what it teaches, what it leaves behind, because that is where its real power lies, not just in what happened, but in what it proved. Thank you for watching Story of the Black Past. If you stayed until this moment, I truly appreciate you. Tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like and subscribe, because there are many more stories like this. Stories that go deeper, stories that uncover what has been hidden. And remember this, power is not always loud, it is not always seen, but when it is guided by understanding, by patience, by purpose, it can change everything, even in silence.